Chet echoes of ancient Rome, a world before screen. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine waking not to the buzz of an alarm, but to the gentle crowing of a rooster in the distance. The first light of dawn filters through wooden shutters, casting long shadows across stone floors. There are no notifications waiting, no screens to check, no endless scroll of other people's curated lives demanding your attention. This is Rome, in the first century of the Common Era, a world where information traveled at the speed of human footsteps, where news arrived with the dust of horses' hooves, and where the most urgent message you might receive would be delivered by a breathless servant at your door. Tonight, we're stepping back nearly 2,000 years to a time when the pace of life moved differently, when people had space to think, to reflect, to simply be. And in this ancient world, we'll meet a man whose wisdom about living well has echoed through the centuries to reach us here, in our hurried modern lives. But first, let's ground ourselves in his world. Picture the streets of Rome at dawn. Not the Rome of tourist postcards, but a living, breathing city of over 1 million souls. The air carries the scent of bread baking in neighborhood ovens, mixed with the earthy smell of olive oil and the faint trace of incense from household shrines. There's no hum of electricity, no rumble of engines. Instead, you hear the clip-clop of donkey hooves on stone, the creak of wooden cartwheels, the distant sound of hammers ringing against metal in workshops already busy with the day's work. This is a world where night truly meant darkness, where the setting sun brought a natural end to most activities, and where people lived by rhythms that had remained unchanged for thousands of years. In the wealthy districts where our story largely unfolds, morning light reveals elegant villas with their red-tiled roofs and painted walls. Gardens filled with rosemary and lavender, small fountains trickling peacefully, courtyards designed to catch the morning breeze. These homes were sanctuaries, spaces where the mind could wander and rest. But even in this seemingly simpler world, there were complexities. There were pressures. There were the same human struggles we know today, just dressed in different clothes. The Roman Empire in the first century was a place of incredible contradictions. Magnificent engineering and brutal slavery existed side by side. Philosophical schools teaching wisdom and virtue flourished in the same city where gladiators fought to the death for entertainment. It was a world of extraordinary wealth and grinding poverty, of remarkable tolerance and sudden violence. At the heart of it all sat the emperor, a single man whose moods and decisions could ripple across 3 continents. And during the decades we'll explore together, Rome would see a succession of rulers whose personalities shaped not just politics, but the very air that thinking people breathed. When our story begins, Augustus had been dead for nearly 3 decades. The first emperor, the one who transformed Rome from a republic into an empire, had left behind a legacy of stability, but also a dangerous precedent. The idea that one man could hold absolute power. His successor, Tiberius, ruled with increasing paranoia and isolation. Picture an emperor who eventually retreated to the island of Capri, governing the known world from a distance, trusting fewer and fewer people as the years passed. Under Tiberius, Rome learned what it meant to live under a ruler who saw enemies everywhere. Then came Caligula. Young, initially popular, but quickly revealing a cruelty and instability that shocked even a society accustomed to violence. His brief reign was like a fever dream, 4 years of excess and terror that ended with his assassination by his own guards. And after Caligula, Claudius, the stammering, scholarly uncle who nobody expected to rule, who surprised everyone by proving competent and thoughtful. Under Claudius, there was a sense of return to sanity, a feeling that perhaps the empire could be governed by reason rather than whim. But empires, like families, carry their wounds from one generation to the next, and waiting in the wings was a young man named Nero. This is the world into which our philosopher was born, a world where political fortunes could change overnight, where intellectual life flourished alongside moral uncertainty, where a thinking person had to navigate carefully between truth-telling and survival. Imagine living in such times, when your words could be reported to the emperor, when your friendships could become dangerous, when the books you read or the ideas you discussed could determine your fate. And yet, imagine also the clarity this might bring, the way such circumstances could strip away the trivial and force you to focus on what truly matters. In this world without constant distraction, without the endless noise of modern media, people had different relationships with their thoughts. They had time for long conversations that meandered through ideas like rivers finding their course. They had evenings that stretched without entertainment beyond what they could create themselves. Evenings filled with reading, with music, with the kind of deep reflection that our busy lives rarely allow. The Romans had a concept they called odium, a word that doesn't translate neatly into English. It wasn't laziness or idleness. It was purposeful leisure, time deliberately set aside for thinking, for reading, for the cultivation of wisdom. It was considered essential for a well-lived life, as important as work or civic duty. Can you imagine? A culture that valued reflection as highly as productivity, that understood the mind needed space to wander and wonder. This was the intellectual atmosphere in which our philosopher came of age. Born into wealth and privilege, yes, but also into a tradition that prized learning and ethical thinking. Raised in a world where philosophy wasn't an abstract academic pursuit, but a practical guide for living well in uncertain times. The great philosophical schools of Athens had established branches in Rome: Stoicism, Epicureanism, Platonism. These weren't just names in textbooks, but living traditions with teachers and students, with ongoing debates about how to live, how to die, how to find meaning in the brief span of human existence, and threading through all of this, the particular challenges of being thoughtful in an empire. How do you maintain your integrity when serving power? How do you speak truth when truth can be dangerous? How do you find inner peace when the world around you seems increasingly unstable? These weren't theoretical questions. They were daily realities for anyone who moved in the circles of education and influence. As we settle into this ancient world together, I want you to feel the weight of its silences, the spaces between words that our modern world has forgotten how to honor. In Rome, conversations had room to breathe. Ideas could develop slowly, like wine aging in amphoras, gaining depth and complexity over time. People wrote letters, real letters, on papyrus and wax tablets, letters that took weeks to reach their destinations. They wrote knowing their words would be pondered, reread, treasured. There was a weight to communication that our instant messages can't carry. They walked, miles and miles, through city streets and country roads, with nothing but their thoughts for company. They sat in gardens and watched the light change, marking time not by digital clocks but by the movement of shadows across sundials. This is the world that shaped the mind we'll come to know. A mind that learned to find strength in solitude, wisdom in uncertainty, and peace in the midst of chaos. Tonight, as we journey together through these ancient streets and into these timeless ideas, let yourself sink into this different pace, this older rhythm. Let the weight of centuries settle around you like a comfortable blanket. The story we're about to explore has waited 2,000 years to reach you. It can wait a few moments more. As you breathe deeply and prepare to meet one of history's most compelling guides to the art of living well. Seneca, the philosopher's path. Our philosopher was born Lucius Annaeus Seneca in the Spanish city of Corduba, sometime around 4 BCE. Even his birthplace tells us something about the expanding world of Rome, how the empire was drawing talent from its furthest reaches, creating a cosmopolitan blend of cultures and ideas. His father, Seneca the Elder, was a man of considerable learning himself, a teacher of rhetoric who understood the power of words, the art of persuasion. In their household, intellectual discourse wasn't just encouraged, it was the very air they breathed. Young Lucius grew up listening to debates about philosophy, politics, and the great questions that had occupied human minds since time began. But the boy was fragile. His health was delicate from the start, plagued by what we might today recognize as asthma, along with other ailments that would shadow him throughout his life. There's something almost poetic about this, how the man who would become one of history's greatest teachers of resilience began life learning to navigate physical limitations. His family moved to Rome when he was still young, and there, in the great capital, his real education began. He studied under the stoic philosophers of his day, men like Attalus, who taught him that philosophy wasn't just an intellectual exercise, but a way of living, a practice, a daily discipline of the mind and heart. Picture him as a young man, walking through those same Roman streets we imagined earlier, but now with the eager step of a student hungry for wisdom. The Stoic schools weren't grand buildings with marble columns. They were often simple spaces where teachers and students gathered to wrestle with life's deepest questions. What drew him to Stoicism? Perhaps it was his early acquaintance with suffering, his body's limitations teaching him that some things were beyond his control. The Stoics taught that freedom came not from controlling external circumstances, but from mastering one's response to them. For a young man whose own body often betrayed him, this must have felt like discovering a secret door to liberation. The core Stoic teaching was deceptively simple, yet revolutionary in its implications. They divided all of existence into three categories: things within our control, things partially within our control, and things completely beyond our control. True peace, they taught, came from focusing our energy only on that first category: our thoughts, our choices, our responses. Seneca absorbed these lessons with the intensity of someone who had found his life's compass. But he wasn't content to remain a student forever. Unlike some philosophers who retreated from the world into pure contemplation, he felt called to engage, to test these philosophical principles in the messy, complicated arena of real life. His first steps into public life were tentative, the path of a young man still finding his way. He began practicing law, using his father's gift for rhetoric combined with his own philosophical insights. But even then, you could see the tension that would define his entire life, the pull between the philosopher's desire for simplicity and wisdom and the ambitious Roman's drive for influence and achievement. This wasn't hypocrisy, though his critics would later claim it was. It was something more complex, more human. He genuinely believed that philosophy should serve the world, not hide from it. That wisdom unused was wisdom wasted. But he was also a man of his time and class, raised with certain expectations, certain definitions of success. His early political career showed promise. He had the intellect, the connections, the rhetorical skills that Rome valued. But he also had something that made the powerful nervous: a moral seriousness, a tendency to speak uncomfortable truths. In a world where political survival often depended on knowing when to stay silent, Seneca struggled with the philosopher's compulsion toward honesty. The tension showed in his writing from this period, letters and essays where you can almost feel him working through the contradictions. How do you maintain philosophical principles while navigating political realities? How do you serve the greater good when the system itself is flawed? These weren't abstract questions for him. They were daily dilemmas. His health continued to be a constant companion, not always a welcome one, but perhaps a necessary teacher. There were periods when he was so ill that he contemplated ending his life, a choice the Stoics considered rational under certain circumstances. But something held him back, perhaps the growing sense that he had work yet to do, wisdom yet to share. These early struggles with mortality gave his later writings their distinctive depth. When Seneca wrote about accepting death, about the impermanence of all things, he wasn't offering abstract philosophical comfort. He was sharing hard-won insights from someone who had walked to the edge and chosen to return. His philosophical practice became more disciplined during these years. Each morning, he would examine his intentions for the day ahead. Each evening, he would review his actions, not to judge himself harshly, but to learn, to refine his understanding, to gradually align his life more closely with his values. This wasn't the rigid self-denial that people sometimes associate with Stoicism. Seneca enjoyed life's pleasures, good food, comfortable surroundings, intellectual stimulation, but he held them lightly, appreciating them without being enslaved by them, ready to let them go without bitterness when circumstances changed. His reputation as a philosopher began to grow, but so did his wealth and social standing. Again, the tension, the questions that would follow him throughout his life. Can a philosopher be rich? Can wisdom and worldly success coexist? Seneca's answer was nuanced. Wealth itself wasn't evil, but attachment to it was dangerous. The key was to hold material things as a steward rather than an owner, to use them for good while remaining inwardly free. His writing from this period shows a man grappling honestly with these contradictions. He didn't present himself as having achieved perfect wisdom. Instead, he positioned himself as a fellow traveler on the philosophical path, sharing insights from his own struggles and failures. This humility would become one of his most endearing qualities as a teacher. Unlike philosophers who spoke from positions of assumed authority, Seneca wrote with the voice of someone still learning, still making mistakes, still discovering deeper truths about what it meant to live well. The political world continued to beckon, with all its promises and perils. He could see how philosophy might influence policy, how wisdom might serve justice on a larger scale. But he was also beginning to understand the costs, the compromises that public life demanded, the ways that power could corrupt even the best intentions. As he moved through his 30s, Seneca was becoming the man history would remember, brilliant, complex, deeply committed to both philosophical truth and practical engagement with the world. The greatest tests of his life still lay ahead: exile, imperial favor, impossible moral choices that would force him to live out his philosophical principles under the most extreme circumstances. But already, in these formative years, you can see the foundation being laid. The habits of mind and heart that would sustain him through triumph and disaster alike, the daily practice of examining his life, the commitment to growth over perfection, the belief that philosophy was meant to be lived, not just studied. Tonight, as you settle deeper into rest, let his example remind you that wisdom isn't a destination, it's a journey, that the questions matter more than the answers, and that every day offers new opportunities to align our lives a little more closely with our deepest values. The boy from Spain was becoming a philosopher, but more than that, he was becoming fully human. Whispers in the Forum, navigating imperial power. The young philosopher who emerged from his studies would soon discover that in Rome, wisdom and power danced a dangerous waltz. As Seneca entered his 30s, the political landscape of the empire was shifting beneath everyone's feet, like sand dunes reshaped by invisible winds. The Emperor Tiberius, Augustus's chosen successor, ruled from his villa on the island of Capri, a brooding figure who had grown increasingly suspicious of everyone around him. In this atmosphere of paranoia and whispered accusations, ambitious young Romans learned to move carefully. Every friendship was scrutinized, every conversation potentially dangerous. Seneca found himself drawn into this world almost despite himself. His rhetorical skills, his philosophical reputation, his family's connections, all of these made him a valuable ally, but they also made him visible. And in imperial Rome, visibility could be as dangerous as it was advantageous. Picture the Forum in those days, not the tourist ruins you might visit today, but a living, breathing center of power. Senators in their white togas bordered with purple, merchants negotiating deals that would span continents, soldiers bearing messages from distant frontiers. And everywhere, the subtle dance of influence and favor that kept the empire running. Seneca moved through this world with the careful grace of someone who understood its rules, but never forgot their cost. He served as a quaestor, one of the junior magistrates who managed the empire's finances. It was practical work, the kind that taught him how power actually functioned beyond the grand speeches and philosophical ideals. But it was also during these years that he began to understand something that would shape the rest of his life: the profound loneliness of those who hold power. He watched senators who commanded armies but couldn't trust their closest friends, wealthy merchants who owned vast estates but lived in constant fear of losing everything, emperors who ruled the known world but slept behind locked doors. This understanding, this compassion for the isolated and powerful, would later inform his most important work. But first, he would learn about isolation himself. In the year 37, everything changed. Tiberius died, and his grandnephew Caligula ascended to the throne. At first, Rome celebrated. The new emperor was young, charismatic, full of promises for a brighter future. The dark years of Tiberius's suspicious rule seemed to be ending. Seneca, now in his early 30s, found himself well positioned in this new court. His reputation as both philosopher and orator had grown, and Caligula initially seemed to appreciate intellectual company. For a brief moment, it appeared that philosophy and power might find a harmonious balance. But Caligula's reign quickly revealed itself to be something far more dangerous than Tiberius's paranoid isolation. The young emperor's behavior became increasingly erratic, his demands more extreme, his cruelty more inventive. The court that had seemed welcoming became a maze of shifting alliances and deadly rivalries. It was in this atmosphere that Seneca encountered a man who would become one of his closest friends and most trusted allies, Sextus Afranius Burrus. Burrus was everything Seneca was not, a career soldier from Gaul, practical where Seneca was philosophical, direct where Seneca was subtle. He had risen through the ranks of the Praetorian Guard through competence and unwavering loyalty. Their friendship was unlikely, the Spanish philosopher and the Gallic soldier. But perhaps that's exactly why it worked. Burrus grounded Seneca's sometimes lofty ideals in practical reality, while Seneca helped Burrus see beyond the immediate demands of military and political life. Together, they navigated the increasingly treacherous waters of Caligula's court. They watched as the emperor declared himself a god, forced senators to worship him, squandered the imperial treasury on bizarre spectacles and vanity projects. They saw how absolute power, unchecked by wisdom or restraint, could corrupt even a promising young ruler. But survival in such a court required more than philosophical insight. It demanded political skill of the highest order. Every word was weighed, every gesture analyzed, every relationship scrutinized for signs of disloyalty. Seneca learned to speak in layers, saying one thing while meaning another, protecting himself and his friends through careful ambiguity. When Caligula was assassinated in 41, Seneca and Burrus found themselves facing yet another transition. The Praetorian Guard, in a move that surprised everyone, declared Claudius emperor. Claudius, the stammering, limping uncle whom everyone had dismissed as harmless, suddenly found himself ruler of the Roman Empire. Initially, this seemed promising. Claudius was scholarly, interested in history and literature, seemingly committed to restoring the dignity and stability that Caligula had destroyed. Seneca's philosophical reputation and literary skills should have made him valuable to such an emperor, but court politics are never simple, and Seneca was about to learn that lesson in the most painful way possible. The trouble began with whispers, as trouble in Rome always did. Someone suggested that Seneca had been too close to Caligula's sisters, particularly Julia Livilla, who was accused of plotting against the emperor. In the paranoid atmosphere of imperial politics, even the suggestion of impropriety was dangerous. The charges were almost certainly false, politically motivated attacks by rivals who saw an opportunity to remove a potential competitor. But in Claudius's court, influenced heavily by his wife Messalina and her circle of advisors, perception mattered more than truth. Seneca found himself facing exile, banishment to the harsh island of Corsica. For a man who had spent his life in the intellectual and cultural center of the world, who thrived on conversation and debate, who needed books and letters and the company of educated friends, it was a devastating blow. Burrus, loyal as always, tried to intervene, but even his influence had limits. The decision was made at the highest levels, and once an emperor had spoken, there was no appeal. Picture Seneca on the ship that carried him away from Rome, watching the familiar coastline disappear, knowing he might never see it again. All his philosophical training, all his stoic principles about accepting what cannot be changed, were put to the ultimate test. Corsica was beautiful in its way, but it was also isolated, primitive, far from everything that had given Seneca's life meaning. The island's rocky shores and sparse population offered little comfort to a man accustomed to the libraries and forums of Rome. But exile, as devastating as it was, also became a kind of gift. Stripped of political ambitions and social obligations, forced to confront himself without the distractions of court life, Seneca discovered depths of wisdom he might never have found otherwise. He wrote prolifically and with new honesty. His letters from this period reveal a man grappling with fundamental questions about purpose and meaning, about how to find contentment when everything familiar has been taken away, about the difference between what we think we need and what actually sustains us. And gradually, slowly, he began to understand that this forced simplicity, this removal from the game of power and influence, might actually be closer to the philosophical life he had always claimed to seek. The exile lasted 8 years. 8 years of solitude and reflection, of learning to find joy in small things, of discovering that happiness didn't depend on external circumstances as much as he had believed. When the letter finally came, the summons back to Rome, Seneca was a changed man, still brilliant, still ambitious, but tempered by suffering, deepened by isolation, more genuinely wise than he had ever been before. A garden retreat. Seeking tranquility. The Rome that welcomed him back was not the same city he had left, and neither was he. The capital had grown more frantic, more demanding, the pace of political life more relentless than ever. But Seneca had learned something on that rocky island, something about finding stillness within the storm. He noticed it first in the gardens, the way Romans of every class sought refuge in green spaces. Even the humblest apartments had their tiny courtyards, their single olive tree or climbing vine. The wealthy, of course, had their vast villa gardens, but the principle was the same. Everyone understood, instinctively, that the human spirit needed sanctuary. The gardens of Rome were marvels of engineering and artistry. Water flowed through carefully designed channels, creating the constant soothing sound of movement. Fountains sparkled in courtyards, their gentle splashing masking the noise of the streets beyond. The Romans understood water, not just as utility, but as balm for the soul. In the imperial gardens on the Palatine Hill, where Seneca now walked as tutor to young Nero, the air was thick with the scent of roses and jasmine. Cypress trees stood in perfect rows, their dark green spires reaching toward the sky. Marble benches were placed at precise intervals, positioned to catch the morning sun or afternoon shade, depending on the season. But it wasn't just the wealthy who understood this need for retreat. The public baths, the thermae, served a similar purpose for ordinary citizens. Here, in the warm, humid air scented with oils and herbs, Romans found respite from their daily struggles. The sound of conversations echoed softly off marble walls, but even the talk was different here. Slower, more contemplative. Seneca often observed how people changed when they entered these spaces, shoulders relaxed. Voices softened. The tight lines around their eyes eased. It was as if the very architecture invited a different way of being, a temporary escape from the relentless demands of Roman life. He wrote about this phenomenon, this human hunger for tranquility. Every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end, he observed. The garden, the bath, the quiet courtyard, these were places where one beginning could end, and another could emerge. In his own villa outside Rome, Seneca created his own sanctuary. The garden was not grand by imperial standards, but it was perfectly designed for reflection. A small pool reflected the sky, surrounded by herbs that released their fragrance when brushed by a passing robe. Lavender, rosemary, thyme, scents that seemed to slow time itself. He would rise before dawn, when the air was cool and the light soft, and walk among his plants. This was his practice, his daily return to himself. The dew on the grass, The first tentative songs of birds, the gradual warming of stone benches as the sun climbed higher. These simple pleasures anchored him. "You must learn to be still," he wrote to his friend Lucilius, "in the midst of activity, and to be vibrantly alive in repose." This was not mere philosophy. It was practical wisdom born from years of observing how Romans, himself included, struggled with the pace of their lives. The villa gardens of the wealthy were elaborate affairs, topiaries shaped into fantastic forms, exotic plants brought from the far reaches of the empire, elaborate mosaics depicting scenes from mythology. But Seneca noticed that the most peaceful gardens were often the simplest. A single perfect rosebush, a small fountain, a bench positioned to catch the afternoon light filtering through olive leaves. In these spaces, Romans practiced a kind of informal meditation. Though they wouldn't have called it that, they simply sat and breathed and allowed their minds to wander. The sound of water, the warmth of sun on skin, the gentle movement of leaves in the breeze, these became teachers, instructing the soul in the art of presence. The bathhouses, too, served as temples of tranquility. The ritual began with the tepidarium, the warm room where bathers adjusted gradually to the heat, then the caldarium, hot and steamy, where tensions melted away with perspiration. Finally, the frigidarium, the cold plunge that shocked the system back to alertness, but a different kind of alertness, cleaner, more focused. Seneca understood that these rituals, these rhythms of warmth and coolness, of solitude and gentle company, were essential to human flourishing. The willing, destiny guides them. The unwilling, destiny drags them, he observed. But in the garden, in the bath, in any space designed for restoration, one could choose to be willing, to surrender to the natural rhythms of rest and renewal. He taught young Nero about this, though he wondered sometimes if the lessons took hold. "Power without wisdom is dangerous," he would say as they walked among the roses. "But wisdom without the ability to find peace, to return to yourself, is impossible to sustain." The emperor-to-be was restless, always moving, always seeking the next excitement. But occasionally, in the early morning garden, Seneca would catch glimpses of the contemplative soul beneath the ambitious exterior. Nero would pause beside a fountain, his face softening as he watched the play of light on water, and for a moment, just a moment, he seemed to understand. These were the victories Seneca treasured. Not the political triumphs, but these quiet moments of recognition, when another human being glimpsed the possibility of inner peace. In the garden, surrounded by the patient wisdom of growing things, such moments seemed more possible, more natural. The Romans, for all their reputation as warriors and builders, understood something profound about the human need for sanctuary. Their gardens weren't mere decoration, their baths weren't simply hygiene, they were acknowledgments that the soul, like the body, needed regular care and feeding. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the villa garden, as the air cooled and the scent of evening flowers began to emerge, Seneca would feel the day's tensions dissolving. This was his practice, his daily return to wisdom, his reminder that beneath all the complexity of human life, simple things remained: water and sunlight, growing things and quiet spaces, the eternal refuge of the contemplative heart. "Life is long enough if you know how to use it," he wrote. And here, in the sanctuary of his garden, surrounded by the patient rhythms of nature, he was learning, day by day, how to use it well. Nero's ascent, a tutor's burden. In Rome, even gardens could not remain separate from the currents of power forever. The letter arrived on a morning when the light fell particularly golden across Seneca's herbs, the imperial seal heavy in his hands, heavier still with possibility. After 8 years of exile, 8 years of learning patience among Corsica's wild shores, he was summoned home, but not merely home. He was called to the most delicate, most dangerous, most hopeful task a philosopher could imagine: to shape the mind and heart of a future emperor. The young Nero was 13 when Seneca first encountered him in the palace corridors, a boy caught between childhood and the terrible weight of destiny. In those early days, there seemed such promise, such genuine curiosity in the prince's dark eyes. "Tell me about the philosophers," Nero would say, settling into their lessons with an eagerness that reminded Seneca why he had first loved learning. "Tell me about Marcus Aurelius, about the good kings who ruled with wisdom," and Seneca would speak, carefully, hopefully, about the philosopher king that Plato had imagined, about rulers who served rather than commanded, about power as responsibility rather than privilege. He watched the boy's face, searching for signs that these seeds might take root. Together with Burrus, his old friend now elevated to command of the Praetorian Guard, Seneca began to dream of something unprecedented, a golden age, guided not by cruelty or caprice, but by reason, by compassion, by the steady principles of stoic wisdom. "We have a chance," Burrus would say during their private conferences, his soldiers' pragmatism tempered by genuine hope. "If we can guide him well, if we can show him a different path." The early signs were encouraging. Nero showed aptitude for rhetoric, genuine interest in poetry and the arts, even flashes of the philosophical temperament. When Seneca spoke of duty, of service to the people, the young prince would nod thoughtfully, ask penetrating questions, but teaching a future emperor, Seneca discovered, was unlike teaching anyone else. Every lesson carried the weight of millions of lives. Every principle had to be balanced against the brutal realities of Roman politics. Every ideal tested against the corrupting nature of absolute power. How do you teach moderation to someone who will want for nothing? How do you instill humility in one whom the world will bow before? How do you speak of simple pleasures to someone surrounded by unimaginable luxury? Seneca found himself walking an increasingly narrow path between the philosopher's duty to truth and the tutor's need to remain trusted, to maintain influence. Sometimes, in the quiet of his study, he wondered if he was compromising too much, adapting his teachings to what a future emperor might find palatable. The palace itself seemed to test every stoic principle he held dear. The endless intrigues, the careful positioning, the way every conversation carried multiple meanings, every gesture calculated for effect. Even his friendship with Burrus, genuine though it was, served political purposes neither could entirely ignore. Yet there were moments, precious moments, when it seemed the experiment might succeed. When Nero would speak thoughtfully about justice, when he would question the excesses he witnessed, when the philosophical lessons seemed to be shaping something good and wise within him. "A ruler's first duty is to his people," Seneca would say, and Nero would repeat it back, seemingly sincere, seemingly understanding. But always there were other influences. The boy's mother, Agrippina, with her own ambitions and machinations, the freedmen and courtiers who whispered different lessons about power and pleasure, about taking what one desired, the very structure of imperial Rome itself, which seemed designed to corrupt even the best intentions. When the palace grew too stifling, when the weight of responsibility pressed too heavily, Seneca would seek refuge in Rome's great bathhouses, those democratic spaces where senator and citizen mingled in the equalizing embrace of warm water and steam. Here, in the gentle heat, surrounded by the soft splash of fountains and the murmur of conversation, he could almost pretend he was simply another Roman, seeking restoration after a long day. The baths had their own rhythms, their own wisdom, the ancient understanding that all bodies, regardless of rank, needed the same simple comforts. "The water remembers nothing of our titles," he would think, sinking into the caldarium's embrace, feeling the heat penetrate muscles tense with political strain. Around him, merchants discussed grain prices, veterans shared old campaign stories, young men debated philosophy with the passionate certainty of those who had not yet learned how complicated wisdom could become, sometimes, in these democratic waters. Seneca would overhear conversations about the imperial family, about hopes for the young prince's future reign, about dreams of peace and prosperity. The people's expectations, he realized, were as heavy as any crown, as demanding as any philosophical principle. They say the new Caesar will be different, he might hear, guided by wise counselors, educated in virtue, and Seneca would close his eyes, letting the warm water hold him, wondering if he and Burrus were equal to such hopes, if any teacher could prepare a young man for the terrible isolation of absolute power, if philosophy, however sincere, could withstand the corruptions that seemed to flow through the imperial palace like an underground river. The steam rose around him, soft and forgiving, carrying away for these precious moments the weight of an impossible task, the burden of shaping a future emperor, the knowledge that history itself might hang in the balance of his success or failure, in the baths, at least. There was only the eternal comfort of warm water, the democratic embrace of heat and steam, the reminder that beneath all human ambitions, all hopes and fears, lay the simple need for restoration, for peace, for the gentle rhythms that had soothed Roman bones for centuries beyond counting. The weight of words, scribes and scrolls. But even in those warm waters, Seneca's mind would turn to another kind of restoration, another rhythm that had sustained Roman civilization for generations, the slow, deliberate work of putting words to papyrus, of capturing thought and preserving it, for minds yet unborn, in his villa. As evening shadows lengthened across marble floors, Seneca would return to his writing desk, to the patient tools of his deeper craft. Here was his reed pen, carefully cut and shaped. Here was his inkwell, dark with the mixture of soot and gum that would carry his thoughts across time. And here, always here, were the scrolls. The creation of a scroll was itself a meditation, a process that demanded the same patience he tried to cultivate in all things. First came the papyrus, those precious sheets made from reeds that grew along the distant Nile, transported across the Mediterranean in ships that moved no faster than the wind could carry them. The reeds were cut, soaked, pressed into thin strips, then layered and pressed again until they formed sheets smooth enough to hold the weight of words. But even before the papyrus reached his hands, it had passed through dozens of others. The Egyptian farmers who harvested the reeds in the shallows of the great river, the craftsmen who knew the ancient secrets of turning plant into page, the merchants who risked storms and pirates to bring these sheets to Roman markets, the shopkeepers who sold them to philosophers and poets, to senators and scribes. Each scroll represented not just the words it would eventually hold, but this entire chain of human labor, human knowledge, human hope, that what was written would matter, would endure, would speak to hearts and minds in years to come. Seneca understood this weight, this responsibility, when he dipped his pen in ink, when he formed the first letter of a new work. He was joining a conversation that stretched back through centuries. The great Greek philosophers whose works had shaped his thinking, the Roman historians who had recorded the rise of the Republic, the poets who had captured the beauty and tragedy of human experience, all of them had sat as he sat now, facing the blank expanse of papyrus, wondering if their words would prove worthy of preservation. The process was necessarily slow, necessarily deliberate. There was no rushing the formation of letters, no hurrying the careful spacing that would allow future readers to follow his thoughts. Each word had to be chosen with precision. Each sentence crafted to carry not just meaning, but rhythm, not just information, but the music of thought itself. And when mistakes were made, as they inevitably were, there was no simple correction. A word written in error might require starting an entire section again, or accepting the imperfection and finding a way to work around it. This, too, was a kind of philosophy, this acceptance that human effort, however careful, however well-intentioned, would always bear the marks of its mortal origins, but perhaps most remarkable, most humbling, was the knowledge of how slowly these words would travel once they left his hands. A letter to a friend in Gaul might take weeks to arrive, assuming the messenger avoided bandits, assuming the weather held, assuming the thousand small chances that could delay or destroy a message fell in his favor. News from the provinces arrived in Rome with the same unhurried pace, carried by official couriers or traveling merchants, by soldiers returning from distant campaigns, or pilgrims making their way to the eternal city. A rebellion on the frontier, a good harvest in Egypt, a storm that had sunk grain ships in the harbor at Alexandria. All of these events reached the capital weeks or months after they had occurred, like echoes of a distant thunder. This slowness created its own kind of wisdom, its own particular challenges. Rumors had time to grow and change as they traveled, to accumulate details that might or might not be true, to arrive in Rome bearing only a distant resemblance to the events that had inspired them. A minor skirmish might become a great victory. A diplomatic success might transform into a humiliating defeat, all depending on who told the story and how many times it had been retold along the way. Seneca had learned to be cautious with such reports, to weigh them carefully against what he knew of human nature, of the tendency to embellish, to dramatize, to reshape events in the telling until they served the teller's purposes rather than truths. This, too, was part of his philosophical practice, this patient skepticism, this willingness to suspend judgment until more reliable information could be gathered, but in his own writing, in the careful formation of his letters to Lucilius, in the treatises that explored the deepest questions of how to live well, he tried to create something different, words that would not change in the telling, thoughts preserved exactly as he had conceived them, wisdom that could travel across any distance without losing its essential truth. He wrote often in the evening hours, when the demands of court and politics had finally released their grip, when he could return to the questions that mattered most. How should a person face adversity? What was the relationship between virtue and happiness? How could one maintain inner peace in a world of constant change and uncertainty? These were not abstract philosophical problems, not mere intellectual exercises. They were the urgent questions of his own life. The challenges he faced daily as he tried to navigate the treacherous waters of Nero's court, as he attempted to guide a young emperor toward wisdom and justice, as he struggled to remain true to his deepest convictions while engaging with the compromises that political life demanded. Each letter, each essay, each carefully crafted sentence was both an exploration of these questions and an attempt to provide answers that might serve not only his immediate correspondents, but readers yet unknown, minds that would encounter his words in years or decades to come, when the specific crises of his time had faded into history, but the fundamental human challenges remained unchanged. Pompeii and peaceful slumber, and perhaps this is what we remember most, not the imperial palaces or the marble forums, but the quieter moments when ancient Romans, like us, sought simply to rest, to find peace at the end of another day, filled with its own particular burdens and joys. Picture, if you will, the terracotta rooftops of Pompeii in the golden hour before sunset, those warm clay tiles that have captured sunlight for nearly 2,000 years, holding heat like cupped palms, releasing it slowly as shadows lengthen across narrow streets where children once played, where merchants once called their wares, where women like you once paused in doorways, watching the light change, feeling that universal moment when day begins its gentle surrender to night. The olive groves beyond the city walls sway in the evening breeze, silver-green leaves catching the last rays of sun, their ancient roots reaching deep into volcanic soil, drawing sustenance from earth that has nourished countless generations. These trees have witnessed empires rise and fall, have sheltered philosophers and farmers alike, their branches offering the same quiet refuge to anyone who seeks it. Seneca would have known groves like these, would have walked among them in the evening hours, his sandaled feet finding familiar paths, his mind finally free from the weight of imperial correspondence, from the endless calculations required to survive in Nero's court. Here, beneath branches heavy with fruit, he could return to the simple truths that sustained him, the recognition that peace is not something we achieve, but something we allow, In his letters to Lucilius, written during those twilight walks, he speaks of watching farmers return from their fields, their faces weathered but content, their day's work complete. "See how they carry themselves," he writes, not with the anxious haste of those who chase after honors, but with the steady rhythm of those who know their place in the natural order, who understand that each day's labor, honestly done, is enough. The women of Pompeii knew this rhythm too, grinding grain in the cool hours before dawn, tending gardens that flourished in the rich soil, drawing water from wells that connected them to the same underground springs their grandmothers had known. Their days were measured not by the frantic pace of ambition, but by the slower cycles of seasons, of growth and harvest, of children growing, of bread rising, of the sun's predictable journey across familiar skies. As darkness settled over the Bay of Naples, oil lamps would flicker to life in windows, casting warm pools of light that spoke of families gathered, of simple meals shared, of stories passed from one generation to the next. The great philosophical questions that consumed Seneca during daylight hours, questions of virtue and duty, of how to live well in an imperfect world, these would settle into something simpler as night approached, the recognition that wisdom often lies not in grand gestures, but in small acts of tenderness, in the decision to lay down the day's worries, to trust that tomorrow will bring what it brings, and that we will meet it as we have met today, with whatever courage and grace we can muster. The thermal baths would grow quiet as evening deepened, the last bathers emerging into cool air, their bodies relaxed, their minds cleared by warm mineral waters that bubbled up from deep within the earth. A reminder that healing comes from sources beyond our understanding, that sometimes the most profound medicine is simply rest. Seneca understood this, understood that all his philosophical training, all his careful cultivation of Stoic principles, ultimately served this simple end: the ability to lie down at night with a quiet conscience, to release the day's accumulated tensions, to trust in the larger rhythms that govern both human hearts and turning seasons. We suffer more in imagination than reality, maning, he wrote, and perhaps nowhere is this more true than in those twilight hours when we review the day's events, when we replay conversations, when we worry about tomorrow's challenges, when we forget that this moment, this breath, this soft pillow beneath our head is enough. The cypress trees that lined Roman roads stand sentinel still, their dark silhouettes pointing toward stars that shone on Seneca's sleepless nights, on his moments of doubt and discovery, on the countless ordinary Romans who found their own ways to wisdom, who learned, as we are learning, that peace is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of acceptance, the willingness to meet life as it comes, to do what we can, and to rest when rest is needed. In Pompeii's final hours, before ash and time claimed those terracotta rooftops, before the olive groves fell silent, there would have been this same transition from day to night, the same moment when busy hands grew still, when worried minds began to quiet, when the great questions of existence softened into the simple gratitude of another day witnessed, another sunset survived, another opportunity to begin again tomorrow. And so we rest, as Romans rested, as humans have always rested, not because our work is finished, not because we have solved all mysteries or resolved all conflicts, but because rest itself is wisdom. Because sleep is the democracy that welcomes rich and poor alike. Because in dreams we remember what daylight sometimes obscures, that we are part of something larger than our individual struggles, part of the great human story that includes Seneca and his students, the bakers of Pompeii, and the mothers who sang their children to sleep beneath Mediterranean stars. All of us connected by this shared need for peace, this common journey toward whatever dawn awaits, this gentle surrender to the night that holds us all.